Okay, so the theme for the walk today is death collapsing into life, which sounds terribly ominous, but I'm going to try to make it not seem that way. I want to talk about a kind of ecological relationship with place as we move through the Parkland walk. So I'm not going to be giving a talk about the history of the railway or of the neighborhood, but rather trying to use the course as a way of interpreting the way that we think about the city, about the way that we build, and to build on some of the wonderful kind of utopian energy that is found in this exhibition. Marvelous to see such a good sense of heart here, such hope for the communities that are encountered along the way, and a kind of activist sense of making change in the world. So all of those things are I'm going to try to work into the walk as we go along. Couple of things just to begin with, the boring bits. As we go along the Parkland walk, there are a number of places where you'll encounter slippery surfaces, uneven stairs, dodgy people lurking in the shrubbery, those kinds of things. So the last, just make friends. But the other things, do try to be careful. When you're walking in a group, you can tend to forget that you're responsible for your own actions. So do try to watch your step as we go along. The other thing that I probably need to explain a little bit before we start is actually kind of where I'm coming from on this particular walk. I'm a landscape architect, which means that I engage with the building of the spaces that we conduct our everyday lives in. So the conception of landscape is that it's something that's confined within parks, or perhaps it's viewed from the train. But the way that I, as a landscape professional, would see landscape is more as a geographer would. Landscape is about a relationship between people and place. It's about a dialogue. So the landscape, the construction of it, is what makes us who we are, and then we have an impact on that landscape as well. So that kind of sense of the building of our identities and the building that we do in the landscape, I'm going to try to bring across as well. The other thing that I'm going to do, because I've just returned from the Utopian Studies Conference, which was the most fun you can have at an academic conference. It was a whole bunch of optimistic people gathered to talk about it. You just couldn't make it up. But I had a great time, and I'm just absolutely charged with positivity and optimism now as a result of that. So if there's any death along this route, it's going to collapse right into life along the way. Finally, I've been thinking a lot about the work of Henri Lefebvre, and if you haven't encountered him, he's a French philosopher that talked a lot about how we build the world around us. And as we move along, I'll talk a little bit about the way that he thinks and the way that that's impacted my thinking about the landscape as well. The first place that we're going to head, if everybody's ready, has everyone used the loo? Do you have water? Yeah. Okay.
Tim, can you say where we're going to end up?
Oh.
So people can get there.
Yes. As this is a linear route, there's no easy way of doing a loop out of it. So we will end at Highgate. So there's a tube station directly at the end of the walk for you to get back, or there are buses there at Highgate. But if you need to get back here, you'll either have to walk the route or take the tube back into King's Cross and then back out again. There's not a really easy way of doing it, unfortunately. There are bus connections. It takes about 40 minutes to walk the Parkland walk. If you're moving and not sort of gazing at things, which is exactly the amount of time it would take you to get back here on a bus. So kind of a catch-22 in terms of the finishing location. The saving grace is that there's a rather nice pub at the end, so if you need to reward yourself with a pint, that opportunity is pleasantly and abundantly available. Right, so let's get underway. The first stop is just over the hill at the very appropriately named Hope picnic and play site. Space to have a picnic. But actually what we're standing in is the first of the ruins that we're going to encounter along the way. You can see that this is all a bit dog-eared, but this was originally built as an adventure playground by the GLC. And I'm only guessing because I haven't been able to find a record of it, but I'm fairly certain there must once have been a water feature that came down along here and presumably would have given a sort of paddling play area. Is there anyone local who has a memory of that at all?
No.
Well, one of these days I'll find out. But at the moment, it's kind of a neglected but rather charming corner of the park. Now, here is where I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce some of the philosophical ideas that are going to underlie our journey today. So this isn't going to be your ordinary walk. I'm going to try to make you all think a little bit. So Henri Lefebvre, French philosopher, is the author of 3 volumes called The Critique of Everyday Life, which sounds rather mundane, but actually is incredibly important because he was one of a number of French philosophers around that time, including Bourdieu, Michel de Certeau, who were all thinking about the way that we live our lives and construct our identities. And Lefebvre wrote in particularly interesting ways. He didn't try to reach a solid conclusion with his work. He was always trying out and testing an idea in different scenarios. So he would say, right, I've got this interesting idea. What happens if I play it out in this way? What happens if I play it out in this way? So it's quite frustrating for people who want certainty to read his work because everything always ends in "it depends," which, of course, is the way things are in the landscape. Anytime you step outside your door, things depend on the weather, things depend on how you're feeling, things depend upon who's in the street. So the way he wrote was very much in a kind of everyday inhabiting sort of mode. So the introduction to the first volume of Critique of Everyday Life, the author of the introduction says, Lefebvre has something of the brilliant amateur craftsman about him, unable to cash in on his own inventions, something capricious, like a sower who casts his seeds to the wind without worrying about whether they'll germinate. Or is it because of Lefebvre's style between flexibility and vagueness, where thinking is like strolling, where thinking is rhapsodic, as opposed to more permanent constructions with their monolithic, reinforced, reassuring arguments painstakingly built upon structures and models. So try to bear that thought in mind. We're going to think and stroll at the same time. And in terms of that rhapsodic function of landscape, it's like music, like the strains of music you hear repeated again and again. The movements you go through in your daily life are familiar ones, but they're always inflected differently. So there's a utopianism at work in all of this, but a very different kind of utopianism from what we're used to. So the utopias we got out of the modernist movement, out of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, were very much kind of totalizing utopias. Wipe the slate clean. Build a new society on an island or another planet. Whereas what Lefebvre was trying to do was to say, how do we begin to look at the little fragments of utopias that people have built? Because this space represents someone's beautiful idea of what the world should be and how we want to provide for the children that we care for and that are in our lives. So what you see here is not just a ruin, but something that's a dream. That's a fragment of a dream of the past that's there to be built upon. So this is a very, very different way of looking about it. And what I'll try to do, again, through this walk is to see how those ideas of these very dependent utopias where it depends, are played out in space. So let's I am going to introduce the sinister opposite at our next stop. We're just going to walk a little bit further over, and there's a paved area before we get into the Parkland walk, and I'll stop there briefly and talk about the dark side of the force. This paved area, as you can see, gets used incredibly heavily with people learning to ride their bicycles and that kind of thing. Simple lesson here is that it would be all too easy to come to this space and say, ooh, that's an awfully large bit of paving, that ought to go and be replaced by trees and grass and that kind of thing, but actually it serves a very, very important function. So always think twice and always revisit a place before you condemn it. But in terms of the clean slate, this is something that came to us heavily during the Thatcher years, wiping the slate clean of a lot of the socialist ambition from the post-war years. And this is the dark side of the force that I want to refer to. The slogan, or one of the slogans of the Thatcher years was, "There is no alternative." Does anyone remember that?
Yeah.
Tina. So Thatcher was called Tina even from time to time because of this particular slogan. But it meant essentially that there is no alternative to economic liberalism, to globalization, all of these kinds of things. And the selling off of our public assets, what's ours, what's our commonwealth. And so this ideology really was about kind of setting the spaces that we live in together in stone. The best example, and this is a rather controversial example, but talking about the way memorialization and death can fix our memories in place. And fixing memories or fixing values or ideals can be a really dangerous thing, because then it's tradition, which doesn't budge, as opposed to custom, which has some flexibility to it. And custom, of course, is what builds the commons, what builds what we create together, the way that we move through landscapes together and construct our places. So the example is actually the World Trade Center Memorial in New York. Does everyone know it? It's been featured quite a bit. So it's 2 pits in the ground where the World Trade Center once stood, with walls of water disappearing into bottomless pits, walls of tears, chasms of pain. I mean, the symbolism is really there for the taking, and it's bleak. And to me, that memorial speaks about the system for which there is no alternative. It's a kind of Thatcherite memorial, in that you look up from that pain at those glass towers that show you that capitalism is still winning, and you think, where is their hope? So those are memorials that say, here you should cry because there's no alternative. So this is the dark side of the force. And we see it in memorials, and we also see it in developments that are built all at once that kind of fix a place and don't allow for its memory to be held. They don't allow for custom to evolve in a place. So as we move into the Parkland Walk, actually, which is along the route of the old railway, which at one point was possibly to become part of the Northern Line, but which was shut down in 1954, there were early on plans to develop the site. So it could have just ended up a housing development, but thanks to people who have a sense of continuity and who were active in defending it, we have a space that we can share that serves as green infrastructure, that serves as a nature reserve, and that serves as a memory of the railway that once was there. And without memory to build upon, you can't really properly have hope. So this is where something like the World Trade Center Memorial shuts down hope, but where something like the Parkland Walk opens up to hope, to prophecy, to utopian ambitions. And I'm sure that the artists from the SEFT Uno project found a lot of hope when they just momentarily reactivated those railway lines, which are real linear connectors to the world around us. Okay, so just a couple of words about the Parkland Walk before we move into it. Now, the beaching cuts, or the beaching axe. Has anyone heard of the beaching?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is huge chunks of the railway were shut down in what was really the first of the type of cuts that we're continuing to see nowadays with the National Health Service, with education, higher education, all of these kinds of things. It was the first of a kind of balance sheet mentality that we suffer from so much now. A balance sheet doesn't allow memory or hope, and it doesn't allow the ideas of communities, what people value, what there is to actually make human lives out of. So beaching is often called one of the most hated men ever, and it's fair, I think, to have a target for some of that ire that we all feel about our disappearing public life. But this line was actually closed before the beaching axe came down. It was closed in 1954 after being used for freight largely after the Second World War. So the beaching cuts certainly would have seen the end of it, but this is actually not. So, in terms of the influence, it's not a very different story from what we find today. So, the beaching report was commissioned by a conservative government with strong ties to the road construction lobby, and then those cuts were continued by a Labour government with strong ties to the road building and road construction unions. So neither side of the political spectrum is free of blame for what happened in the beaching axe. Okay, let's today, along with so many people who are utterly committed to the idea of the bus. So yes, it's public transportation, but the kinds of efficiencies you get with rail are far above and beyond the efficiencies you get with roads. But this is not to say that there's not a romance of the bus, as that large crowd down there will certainly attest to. Abu Dhabi and how that shapes people and how it's been utterly transformed in the last 40 years by massive economic growth and by a rush for oil wealth. Whereas what you would have had before was a traditional nomadic culture that very much relied on each other. So to some extent you could say a utopian sensibility of people coming together in a collective was made necessary by hardship, by the difficulty of surviving in that kind of environment. So of course the counter argument is to say, well, you know, as long as we're wealthy, why do we need to come together? You know, why do we need this association? I think the arguments are fairly clear that we do need each other, that the more isolated you are, the more needy you are, and the more reliant you are on products and services, which just feeds the system. We've got a co-op here which actually talks about the ways that people are still working together in order to achieve things. So this building, I believe, is completely given over to people painting and making things and exhibiting their work. So this is another sort of utopia. And on a small scale. But then again, this is one of those utopian fragments that's there to be woven into the fabric of this landscape and of this everyday life. So about the Parkland Walk very quickly, this is part of the whole Capitol Ring. So this runs right around inside, you know, through Richmond Park and a number of other areas. Fascinating to walk the whole route, and it takes a good few days to do so. So highly worthwhile if you're looking for something to do with one of your summer weeks. Periodically, as we go along, there's a little train map that shows you where we're at. So you can keep those in mind, and I'll also try to orientate you a little bit. One thing that I'll ask you. Is just as we move through in a large group, if you could just try to be mindful of people bicycling and coming through on their own. There's a tendency to kind of clog a whole path if we're a large group. So just try to kind of look over your shoulder from time to time and let people through and be polite. Okay, let's move on just a little bit more. Of actually the topography of the railway. So this site is kept cleared because the grassland provides a certain type of biological niche, so this is good for biodiversity. This is essentially an edge habitat, so all along the way you find a lot of species that really thrive on the rich edge of the woodland, and you also see a really interesting mix of species, of both plant species and insect species, animal species, all of those kinds of things that are associated with not just the native plants that are here, but the mix of kind of escaped exotics that you'll find along the way. I don't know if anybody noticed, but there's a particularly fine fig tree that we passed along the way, just kind of hanging out here because it's an urban site and it's a fruitful mix, to make a pun. Sorry about that. So if I could use that idea of the fruit, though, perhaps to kind of talk a little bit more about Lefebvre's ideas. One of his big points was he talked about the theory of the moment. And this is not a moment as measured in time, so not an instant, but a kind of human moment. Those moments that have meaning for us, that we express emotionally and bodily in space. So the example that comes to me is that a Lefebvrean moment that extends into the past and extends into the future would be, for example, you're out in the strawberry patch in June and you pick that strawberry that's warm and that you're savoring the texture and the sweetness of that strawberry, and it's not just that moment. It's not just that strawberry in that moment, but it's a reminder of all strawberries in all Junes, in all places. And it's also a reminder of all of the possible strawberries in all possible Junes. So in that moment is collapsed a whole history of inhabitation, occupation, taste, joy, pleasure, exploding into the past, exploding into the future. So that connection with where we've been is utterly what propels us into a positive future. So it's a deliciousness in the moment that is really, really important to a utopian view of the world. So this moment here hopefully will remind us of all moments on the Parkland Walk into the future, and thinking about what this serves as an asset, both for people and for the other species that use this particular pathway. So that's the antidote to this kind of fixed memory, a memory that is kind of legislated or given to us from on high. It represents the kind of moment that we can use to make real change in real places for the things that we care about. Okay, so as it's going to be kind of difficult to stop this, you're kind of a juggernaut actually. So there are lots of little things to look at along the way. What we've just come past, this is marker number 4, which oh, hold on. Marker number 4 doesn't appear. So this really is just indicating to people that are walking along the path that this is an open area, that it's maintained as an open area, and largely by volunteers. So again, it's people understanding their place and working together to value it, to build it, and to provide a resource for themselves, for their community. What we're going to get into now is that you might have seen a concrete block along the way. There'll be another one just coming up. Those are left over from the signaling posts. The next stop along is where Stroud Green Station used to be. And when we come to the bridge there, you'll be able to look down to your right and see where the old station house was. And it's still in good repair and inhabited and all of that kind of thing. So a lot of the infrastructure for the railway still exists along the way. What else should I tell you about? The other thing to think about as we go along is that most of this vegetation has only been here since the 1970s, when the line stopped being maintained. And one of the really interesting ways this line was maintained is that actually there would be periodic fires just from the steam trains along here. So there'd be brush clearing by fire, but not purposefully. It was just the nature of running steam trains along a line. Probably the other interesting thing to bear in mind is that actually vegetation would have been largely due to the fact that the toilets in the trains emptied straight onto the tracks. So you would find a lot of wild tomatoes, excuse me, growing along the way. So try to imagine a memory of occasional brush fires and juicy picnic fruits as a result of the passing of the trains. What I want to talk about here is actually the death collapsing into life thing, and about a little bit of ecological thinking. So this kind of there is no alternative thinking is a very either-or kind of mentality. You know, either you do this way or there is no other way. But I've talked about the fact that every moment is kind of dependent upon the weather and your mood and all of those kinds of things in the city. It's no different in terms of the ecology that we see surrounding us. So it's not like something dies and then something else grows out of it. That's part of it. But in ecology, things can be sort of half dead and giving life to something that's kind of half living. And then there are parasitic relationships, and there's never a kind of final end to it. What you always see is a constant flux, a constant change. The other thing to be aware of in terms of absolutes in thinking about ecology and thinking about places like this is that there's a myth of what we call natural balance. We assume that there's this kind of perfect balance to nature that it would achieve, perhaps if we weren't here. If you have a roam around the internet, you'll come across an organization called the Voluntary Human Extinction Society, and they're serious. They see humanity as a virus on the planet, and that the Earth would survive and thrive were we not here in ways that it doesn't otherwise. It's a really, that position is a fallacy because it assumes that we are not nature. So obvious in many ways. And it also kind of assumes that cities aren't nature. or that don't accommodate or work with nature. In the same way that a beaver dam or a beehive is a habitat, is a constructed built environment, the city is our human habitat. It's what we build around us. Of course, we have reason as well as instinct to guide us, and we also have a certain kind of ratcheting effect of cultural evolution, which means that we can move more quickly in terms of evolution than other species can, because we can remember and act on that memory and pull ourselves forward. So that has positives in that we can improve our lives immeasurably in various ways, and you just need to look at how much longer people are living, how much more comfortable we are now than we were in the late 1800s when this line was built. So that cultural evolution is a really positive thing for us as a species, or can be for us as a species and our habitat. But again, that ecological thinking needs to be introduced into our political processes as well if we're going to be effective at holding on to these little pieces of utopia in our own habitat. So I think when you look around, what you can really see is things that are half alive, coming into life, things that are half dead, things that are dormant. So this whole beautiful cycle that we see around us is a really different way of connecting with the world and a different way of moving the world forward. It's about holding on to those little bits that we love and then moving forward and leaving things behind. Okay, so just ahead of us, things get delightfully greener, darker, and I'm sure you've seen some of the remnants of the electrics and that sort of thing along the way, but there'll be a lot more of that apparent as we move along. So do keep an eye out for where the railway infrastructure used to be, and all kind of giving rise to new life behind it. Any other comments or?
How far did we go right on the side?
It varies because the width of the route varies because of the topography. So say for example you've got I think I can the lie of the land. So the hilliness. So okay, in order to get a railway line to stay level, this is pretty much level the whole way. Trains don't like to climb or descend too quickly. So essentially what you need to do is knock a bit off the top of the hill and then fill in the next valley in order to move along. So, thank you. And a railway embankment is just kind of like that. So the higher you build the embankment, the bigger its footprint. So here, you can see the backs of the houses, which shows you that the width is really quite minimal here. But other places where we're going up much higher above the surrounding houses, the width is much more. So it just varies. And then there are other places where there are sort of long slopes down to the railway that are just a little bit too steep to build housing. So a real mix. And any other questions or comments? I guess one other thing to say about railway lines in general is that you're looking at the backs of houses. No one builds their house facing a railway line, rather they face the street. So if you think about that in terms of identity and how we present ourselves to the world, the facade of a house is the front that you want to show the world. It's like putting your face on in the morning before you leave the house. But backsides of houses kind of show all the lumpy bits of our everyday lives. So the view from the train is always really interesting because you see everybody's dirty secrets. You see their laundry, you see what color their knickers are, you know, all of those kinds of things at the back of all the sewage pipes are there and that kind of thing. So it's another kind of view into how we build the landscape and how we present ourselves in the landscape. You know, the kind of dishevelment in which you might wander around the house in your pajamas in the morning with your hair askew and that kind of thing is completely different to the way you'd present yourself in the street, and that's exactly what the facade of a house is versus the rear elevation of a house. Okay, so let's go look at more of the backs of things. Very quickly going to point out, this is a bit of British habitat called acid grassland. And no, it's not where hallucinogens are consumed. It's a particularly infertile type of grassland. It's very low in line, very, very low in fertility, and it supports a quite unique mix of flora and fauna. So there's a special type of ant that only lives in this particular habitat. So this is an ant utopia here. If ants could reason, they would think we've got it good here. But fortunately, we can reason for them, and this is maintained as a grassland. So at least humans understand that ant utopia needs a bit of work.
Yes, I have a question. How much of this growth was encouraged? How much is left to be done?
Good question. So the question was, how much of this is just natural? How much of it just sprung up by itself? It is kind of a mix. There are some places where there were trees planted in the memory of someone. So a little further on, we'll see some cherry trees and things like that that were planted as a memorial. Other things have escaped, like the fig tree, and most of this is really just native British vegetation, or what we think of as native. So the sycamore, plane tree, isn't native, but it's so common that you'll find it all along the route. The English elm is quite well represented along here. English oak. So one of the things that you can, some of the trees that are sort of further off might be older, might be as much as 80 years old, but any of the vegetation that's kind of right along the route isn't going to be any older than the 1970s. So one of the things you can do is you can look at different tree species and think, ooh, an oak has only grown that much since 1970, and yet that plane tree is up a whole lot more. So you'll see ash, oak, elm, all of those kinds of things along the way, and you get it. It's nice to have a little benchmark in time to see how differently things develop. Right, so coming up just ahead of us is the brick road arch for Crouch Hill Road, and then there's another arch just beyond. We're also going to come to a new school, which is one of the zero carbon schools up on the hill above. So you know, again, a utopian endeavor to build a school, although there was a significant amount of opposition because the school that was built replaced some buildings that the community had come to love. So there was an erasure and a writing of a new utopia on top of it. Again, just a little fragment of utopia, but the question is, should we do that kind of erasing along the way, even if we think what we're building is a better world? It depends, I guess, is the best answer. Right, let's keep. Here's a place where we've got overlapping utopias and dystopias. And Gary, you might be able to help me with this. Gary's written a book on street art. This is more Yeah. But actually, there's a website called Street Art Utopia, which showcases some of the better pieces of street art. Now, this is a very common push and pull on the issue of graffiti. the friends of the Parkland Walk get incensed because the graffiti artists paint the rare ferns and things like that as they're painting the walls, and they're compromising the ecology of the space. And actually, many days when you walk through here, you've got to come through a cloud of spray can paint in order to appreciate this part of the walk. So there is a real conflict here. And there's an interesting thing about graffiti now where, you know, artists like Banksy and such have brought it into the mainstream and legitimized it in a lot of ways. However, most people still see graffiti as a marker of poverty, as a marker of adversity and social decay, anger, shiftlessness, you know. And most graffiti artists tend to be around 14, 15 years old, seeking to make their mark on the world, and they've got the energy to do it, and they want to do something risky. So graffiti is a kind of really interesting place. There have been a number of experiments in a number of different cities. Let me think, Paris, well, London in many places, Bruges and Ghent have all legalized graffiti walls. And where they work, they're amazing because you get these 14, 15-year-olds who are looking for role models, and they find artists to work with on these walls. And so they're actually kind of carried along, and they find a community in that way, instead of endangering themselves on the railway track. It doesn't always work. In Helsinki, what it did is it spawned a whole new generation of graffiti artists who then practiced on these walls and then put it everywhere. So they created a greater problem in Helsinki. So again, does it work? It depends.
I think it's a time for especially territorial things. Can I suggest that this graffiti we're seeing here is legitimised? I don't think this is. I think there's youth groups. I think this is. I've seen this graffiti going on because I come up here quite a lot.
Yeah, no.
This is legitimate.
People are here during the daytime doing the graffiti. So and no one challenges them. Whether that's been officially legitimized or whether it's just overlooked.
Well, there's a youth club there, you see, and I think that they may oversee it to some extent. I may be wrong. I've seen adults, responsible looking adults around when the graffiti's happening, so I think
In many places, local authorities don't feel comfortable saying, yes, go ahead and do it, because then they have to argue with the community. So it's allowed but not specifically legal. So it exists in a kind of murky gray area. And actually that's custom rather than law. Custom eventually gets written into law. Okay, so as we go further on up here, Aurora School? Ashmount School is just up to our left. There's a skate ramp, and then yet more
Can I
interesting.
just mention the skate ramp? I read in the paper that it was a contested skate ramp because Islington put it up without consulting with Harrogate for a noise. It's right on the borders between Islington and Harrogate. There was a great lot of stuff in the papers about how infuriated Harrogate were about the lack of consultation. So it's a contested site. This is so fantastic. I've never thought about my neighbourhood in the way you're describing it. It's brilliant.
Oh, good. Good.
Wow.
I'm not quite sure whether the artist was Cornish, but I'm assuming that must be the case. And I did look up the artist. This was from the mid-1980s, so this was in the early stages of when the community was campaigning to build the Parkland Walk. So this was one of the landmarks that came here. If you look on the Parkland Walk's website, it says this mythological creature kind of symbolizes the regenerative power of nature. Well, not quite. I looked up the Spriggan, and the Spriggan was a kind of malevolent beast and probably more symbolized the adversity of nature rather than the regenerative power. So much of what we built together as a society has to do with our collective winning ground against nature. So the Spriggan were depicted as grotesquely ugly. This is from Wikipedia. And were said to be found at old ruins and barrows, guarding buried treasure and generally acting as fairy bodyguards. So these are mythological tough guys. They'll take out your kneecaps, huh? They were also said to be busy thieves. Though usually small, they had the ability to swell to enormous size. They were sometimes speculated to be the ghosts of the old giants. Certainly their disposition was poor, and they caused mischief to those who offended them. They sent storms to blight crops, and sometimes stole away mortal children, leaving their ugly changelings in their place. In one story, an old woman got the better of a band of Spriggans by turning her clothing inside out, turning clothing supposedly being as effective as holy water or iron in repelling fairies to gain their loot. So the Spriggan is not necessarily a nice woodland sprite. This is a somewhat malevolent presence.
Was that there in the days of the railway?
No, this is from the 1980s, so it was well after the railway was gone. But if you didn't know it was there, you'd walk right by it. So it's one of those delightful surprises. That's a landmark that locals can own.
Doing the job that I do when the person so where you go.
Yeah.
So many people miss so much.
I've just been reminded, always look up.
Yes.
Yeah. Because you never know when a piano might be falling.
Well, yeah.
This is the ruins of Crouch Hill End Station. So this is the most intact of the stations along the route, and I think it's quite wonderful. It forms a sort of theater to move through as you come along. So there's cafes and former rail infrastructure up above as well.
Thank you.
Let's see. So just beyond this, there's another good photo opportunity. There's a plane tree, which I think it must have been an electrical box or maybe a shelter for the railway workers that's been overwhelmed by this tree, and then the wall has started to fall away. So that's a rather lovely thing to see up here on the right. And then there'll just be a few more things to point out along the way, but I think at this point, if it could be me talking a little bit less and everybody else having your observations, it would be great to hear what you guys think as well. I think this is magical.
It was, I think, 1954, the last one.
Yes.
I seem to vaguely remember goods trains coming up here later than that, because I was only born in '53. But I'm not part of this group. I'm really. You know what I mean? But I can. It was always known as the Ali Pali line. It used to go up. You know Alexandra Palace, where the aerial is. It was the opposite side to that where it ended. You know what I mean? It sort of branched off at Highgate, and one line went straight ahead, and this one, it used to go Finsbury Park, Stowe Green, Crouch Hill, Highgate, Cranley Gardens. It went under Muswell Hill. There was a Muswell Hill station, and then Alexandra Palace. That's how it went.
Brilliant. That's our local knowledge.
Of course, it was steam engines, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. The freight ran on here from 1954 until the mid-70s, or until the early 70s, and
How did the come to become possible? Was it
no, it wasn't the GLC. It's on the boundary of two councils. So Haringey, which is the southern half of it, at one point just wanted to develop it, but met with local opposition on various grounds, on the fact that this is a valuable ecological nature resource, but that also it represents a recreational land, and very much so. I mean, you see how many bicycles are coming by and how many dog walkers. And love dogs or hate dogs, they really bring communities together. People meet with their dogs and get to know each other. So this is, has a tremendous community resource. And it's for those reasons that the Friends of the Parkland Walk was formed, and because it took a mutual group, a collective group, volunteering their time in order to make this happen, especially because it cuts across borough boundaries. It's a bizarre thing about London governance, is that it's at those edges that are so rich for ecology are really poor for councils because they don't want to engage there. So it took the local communities.
But it's still those councils, am I right, isn't it, how they control the Parkland Walk and governance? And then the Friends are like a
they're the
caretakers,
yeah.
Yes. But the heavy, but it is maintained by the council?
No, it's maintained by the volunteers, as far as I know. The council is probably responsible for the accesses, but there's certain things that I think the council wouldn't get away with if they were, like if you look at this set of stairs here, they're really treacherous. They're all kind of sloping, and they're when it rains, they're extremely slick. So the council, if they were taking full responsibility of that, would have to spend a lot of money. But as a volunteer community resource, there's, who do you blame? Which is good. The Spriggans. Yeah.
I looked on Google Maps and obviously it's not there, but talking of utopias, it's on OpenStreetMap, and someone has categorized most of the walk and has added, you can see it like, it's been added in the OpenStreetMap, which is like a free Google Maps made by people. So, poor people.
I've been toying with the idea of starting a project where we could map fragments of utopia on OpenStreetMap, so that communities could kind of pinpoint those little utopian moments. So keep an eye out. I may get around to doing that.
I would love to do it on bike, by bike.
Is it this way?
Yeah, those of you who are, and the path comes just up the hill, and then you're in Highgate, so we're essentially at the end of the walk. I don't know if any of you guys noticed, but this wonderful lamppost that's just there makes me think of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. All it needs is a light dusting of snow, and then, all sorts of magical things, and all those lions that live here will naturally appear on the trail. But that's also kind of what those little fragments of utopia are all about. They make the link between imagination and magic, that in order to make something change, in order to make something happen, in order to make the world a better place, what's needed is a real imagining, a belief in what can happen, how things can change for the better. And then that imaginary, that utopian imaginary, has power, just in the same way that magic does. So I think that magic is a real thing. It's not about incantations. It's about imagining a better future and then working together to make it happen. So the Parkland Walk, very much a utopian fragment, very much about the imagining of a community, of working together to build something that's good for them, that's good for everyone, that's good for us, that's good for the planet. So there are a lot of deaths that it took to get here, but every single one of those deaths, whether it was the railroad or whether it was an idea that just expired along the way, all of those deaths were fruitful in some way. And the future of this will depend upon whether people continue to invest their time in it You know, this might only be a moment of utopia, but it does represent that possibility. It keeps that possibility alive. So like that strawberry that exists in every June, and for every June to come, the idea of the Parkland Walk, I think, can feed the possibilities for these types of futures in every community, everywhere. That is probably a good place to end on as positive a note as possible. I'm definitely going to have a pint, so if anyone